You think a ghost needs an old mansion to live in. You're wrong. Sometimes they just need to find a way to ride along. Welcome to the Black Hour Stories. Tonight, we're confirming one thing. What you film watches you back. This is the story of a man named Kyle who thought capturing a genuine paranormal moment on video was a career goal, not a death sentence. He found the ghost, but the ghost found him better. Listen close, because the real footage never starts with a scream. It starts with the quiet feeling that you aren't alone anymore. Kyle wasn't a brave man, but he was stubborn. He drove a rusty sedan and carried a camera that cost more than the car. He chased ghosts the way other people chased storms, always on the edge of the action, always hoping for the big payoff. This time, the action was a small, empty church in rural Ohio. Everyone called it the Whispering Chapel. They said the sounds came from the back pew, where a traveling preacher died alone 70 years ago. Kyle went in late, around 2 in the morning. He set up his tripod in the center aisle, and the air was dead cold, even though it was summer. He didn't see anything at first, just the dust floating in the moonlight that cut through the tall, dirty windows. Then his camera's battery died, which was strange since it was fully charged. He put in a fresh one and started recording again. He didn't notice the faint, dark shape sitting in the preacher's pew when he checked the screen. He heard the whisper then. It wasn't words. It sounded like dry leaves being dragged across rough concrete, or maybe a dozen hungry mouths trying to speak at once. Kyle felt the hair stand up on his arms. He aimed the camera. The shape in the back pew was clearer now. It looked like a hunched-over old man, but his body was just a heavy shadow, thick and blacker than the darkness around it. Kyle saw it lift its head. This was the moment he should have run, but Kyle was recording. He was getting the footage. He held the camera steady as the shadow figure stood up, smooth and slow, like oil rising in water. It didn't walk. It seemed to glide. It moved toward the altar, and the air around it shimmered like heat coming off pavement. Kyle whispered to himself that this was it, the evidence he needed. He started backing up toward the door, never taking the lens off the figure. The figure reached the altar, and then it turned. It wasn't looking at the altar. It was looking right at the camera, right at Kyle. He said later that where the face should have been, there was just a swirling, awful emptiness, like a deep hole was staring out of the darkness. And that was when Kyle noticed the small, fast clicking sound coming from the camera itself. Not the whisper anymore. A sound like claws tapping wood. He fumbled for the doorknob. The shadow figure started moving toward him, not gliding now, but moving with a quick shuffling gait. Kyle finally got the door open and scrambled outside. He didn't stop running until he reached his old sedan. He threw the camera onto the passenger seat and tore out of the parking lot, gravel spitting everywhere. He drove an hour, heart pounding, until he hit the highway. He was safe, he thought. He checked the camera. The red recording light was still blinking, even though he knew he hadn't turned it off after he threw it onto the seat. He reached over to stop the recording and saw the screen. The footage was grainy, but it clearly showed the shadow figure, no longer in the church, but sitting right next to the lens. It was pressed up against the camera housing, filling the screen with that swirling, empty blackness. Kyle made it home to his small apartment in the city just as the sun was coming up. He locked the door and pulled the blinds shut. He had the footage. He had proof. But he also had a terrible, sinking realization that whatever he had filmed was now inside his apartment with him. He could smell it, to a sharp, metallic smell, like old blood and cold copper. He kept the camera in its bag in the closet. For 3 days, he barely slept. He felt cold all the time. He started hearing small noises, the clicking sound again, coming from the closet, and sometimes a quick, dry, shuffling sound right outside his bedroom door. He tried to tell himself it was the old building, the pipes, the neighbors. But he knew it wasn't. On the 4th night, Kyle woke up to a new sound. It was louder now. The shuffling was definitely in the hall, and it was scratching at the bedroom door. He reached for his phone to call the police, but then he heard something else, something awful. The thing was whispering again, that sound of dry leaves and hungry voices. But this time, the whispering was coming from the camera bag, which was sitting on the floor inside his bedroom closet. He froze. He hadn't brought the bag out of the closet. He definitely hadn't placed it on the floor. He slowly looked over at the closet door. It was closed, but the gap at the bottom was thick with a blacker-than-night shadow. It was leaking out of the closet. Kyle sat up in bed, breathing fast. The shadow under the door thickened, and the scratching stopped. The whispering stopped. Then the blackness under the door began to rise, slowly spreading up the wood. It was thin at first, like smoke, but it got darker, growing dense. It was climbing the door. He jumped out of bed and backed up against the far wall. The shadow finally took shape, peeling away from the wood. It formed that same hunched, empty figure he had filmed in the church. It wasn't the shadow anymore. It was the thing. And it was clearly closer, more defined, and far more solid than it had been in the chapel. The thing raised an arm, and the empty space where its face should have been turned toward Kyle. He could see the distortion in the air where its body was, like looking through heat rising from a fire. The metallic smell was overwhelming. It took a step, and the floorboards groaned under a weight that shouldn't have been there. Kyle didn't have time to run. He just screamed once, a thin, useless sound that was swallowed instantly by the apartment. The last thing he saw, the very last thing, was the empty place where the thing's face was located rushing toward him. The last thing he heard was that dry, awful whisper finally becoming one single clear word right in his ear. Mine. The police found the apartment empty. No forced entry, no signs of a struggle. The only thing out of place was the professional camera, sitting upright on the bed, still running. They played the memory card. The last few seconds showed the dark, grainy image of the bedroom ceiling, then just a sudden, all-consuming blackness, accompanied by a quick, sharp clicking sound and that low, hungry whisper. And then, static. That's the end of Kyle's footage. Whatever Kyle recorded, it didn't just want the church. It wanted him. And once the lens found the ghost found the lens. It got a free ride home. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. And if you like stories where the evidence is the curse, hit the like button and subscribe for more Black Hour terror. Imagine a world where the glass shows everything but you. This is the story of the old Miller place, a house that stole a little piece of everyone who looked into its antique glass. Welcome back to the Black Hour Stories. Tonight, we're looking at a place that plays tricks on the eyes and the mind. The Miller house was built in 1890, and it was famous for two things: its size, and the fact that every mirror inside was said to be haunted. But the haunting wasn't a shadow or a face. It was an absence, a complete, terrifying lack of a reflection. Sarah and Ben bought the Miller house for a steal. It was huge, full of dark wood and original fixtures. The previous owners left everything behind, especially the antique furniture. This included every single mirror in the house. There were tall, ornate mirrors in the hallways, small, silver-backed ones on the dressing tables, and even a massive, floor-to-ceiling mirror set into the wall of the master bedroom. They were all beautiful, but they felt cold, even on a sunny day. Right away, Sarah noticed the reflection issue. She walked past the hall mirror and didn't see herself. She stopped, looked back, and saw the wallpaper, the antique coat rack, and the dim light fixture. But no Sarah. Ben thought she was tired. He walked past it and joked, "See? No ghost." But when he looked, the reflection showed the coat rack, the wallpaper, but no Ben. Just the empty space where he stood. They tried another mirror, then another. The same thing happened every time. The antique glass showed the room perfectly, down to the dust motes, but it never showed their living bodies. They saw the door behind them, the curtains, the furniture, but never their faces or figures. They realized this wasn't just a quirk of the light. Something was wrong. They called a glass specialist, who said the mirrors were just very old silver-backed pieces. He found nothing unusual about the material itself. They started covering the mirrors with sheets and blankets. The house instantly felt better, less cold. But they still had to live there. One afternoon, Ben was in the dining room, pulling a sheet over a long, narrow mirror. As he draped the cloth, he saw a quick, unsettling movement in the glass. It wasn't him. It was a person, thin and pale, standing right where he was, but wearing clothes from maybe 100 years ago. And then it vanished as the sheet covered it. He dropped the sheet and pulled it off, fast. The mirror showed the empty dining room. No Ben, no pale figure. He told Sarah. She was already terrified. She admitted she had looked into the master bedroom mirror earlier just to check. It was their faces that were missing. But this time she saw a slight, blurry movement in the glass where her reflection should have been. It looked like a person in the background, far away, watching. But there was no one in the room behind her. The fear started to change their bodies. They stopped feeling like themselves. Sarah started forgetting simple words, and Ben couldn't hold a complete thought. They felt heavy, like their minds were being slowly emptied. The house was cold again, even with the mirrors covered. One morning, Sarah went into the kitchen and paused by the small, wall-mounted mirror above the sink. The sheet had somehow fallen off. She felt drawn to it. She stared into the glass. It showed the sunlit kitchen, the counters, the stove. And then she saw it, not her reflection, but a faint silvery vapor clinging to the surface of the glass like a residue. As she watched, the vapor began to swirl and condense. It wasn't a body. It was just energy, but it felt focused, like a predator was gathering its strength. She heard a low humming sound coming from the glass. It sounded like a slow, deep breath being taken. She felt a sudden sharp tug, a physical sensation, as if something invisible had reached into her chest and pulled. She screamed and stumbled back, holding her chest. The silvery vapor snapped back into the glass, vanishing, leaving the surface clear, but still showing no Sarah. When Ben rushed in, he found her shaking, whispering, It's taking us. It's collecting pieces. That night, they decided to smash the mirrors. They took a hammer to the first one, the huge hall mirror. The glass shattered, but it made no sound, just a dull, dead thump. The shards fell to the floor, and when Ben picked up a piece, he looked into it. It was still reflecting the dark hallway. But when he looked at his hand holding the shard, the glass showed the floor underneath, not his hand. It was as if the reflection had been deleted right where his body was. They realized that the glass itself wasn't the problem. The mirrors were just windows to something else, and that something else was hungry. It wasn't interested in their images. It was interested in their presence, their substance. It was slowly drawing out the essence of them, leaving behind empty shells that still looked alive but didn't feel real anymore. They drove to a motel that night. When they looked into the clean, modern bathroom mirror, they saw their reflections immediately. Pale, wide-eyed, exhausted, but they were there. For the first time in weeks, they felt a desperate relief. But the next morning, Sarah got up and looked into the motel mirror. She saw the bright walls and the sink. She saw Ben sleeping in the bed behind her, but she did not see her face. She blinked, feeling that terrible metallic cold returning. She looked at Ben. His face was gray. She shook him awake. He looked at her and then turned slowly to the mirror. Ben gasped. He saw her reflection for a second, a thin gray outline, and then it flickered and disappeared. Then he looked at the mirror and saw the room. He saw Sarah standing there. But he did not see himself. The curse had followed them. The house didn't need the glass to work. It just needed to start the process. They had seen the pale figure in the glass, and now they were becoming the pale figures, leaving their substance behind in the Miller house. They looked at each other, their faces disappearing one by one in the motel room mirror, and they knew they were lost. They were just shadows riding along in their car, driving away from the house. But the house had already taken the part of them that mattered most. It wasn't a shadow or a phantom they had seen. It was the stolen reflection of someone who had already paid the price. And that house, the Miller place, will keep showing the empty rooms until it is completely finished with its victims. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. And if you like stories where the curse follows you home, hit the like button and subscribe for more Black Hour terror. Every family has its secrets, but for the Hendersons, the secret was buried right next to the grandparents, and it wasn't the dead that cared. Welcome back to the Black Hour stories. We've all seen the old family cemetery plots, those rows of peaceful stone markers. But tonight, we're talking about the one grave that has no name, no dates, and no stone. This is the story of the Henderson family, who learned that sometimes the forgotten dead are the ones who want to be remembered the most. The Henderson family plot was in the oldest part of the county cemetery. It was a neat little square with 5 headstones, all gray marble, placed in 2 rows. David Henderson, a history teacher, went there every Sunday to clean up the ivy and leave fresh flowers. It was a habit he learned from his father. One Sunday, he noticed something new. Right outside the perfectly marked Henderson boundary, touching the corner post of his grandmother's plot, was a fresh mound of earth. It was clearly a new grave, but there was no marker, no temporary wooden cross, and no sign of recent funeral activity. It was just a bare, strangely large hill of dark soil. David asked the groundskeeper, an old man named Walt. Walt just shrugged, which was his answer for everything. "New dirt," he said. "Happens all the time." David didn't like the answer. This wasn't just new dirt. It was a fresh, unmarked grave right beside his dead family. He tried to find the paperwork for the plot, but the records showed nothing bought or sold near his family's spot for 20 years. He felt a deep sense of wrongness about it. It was like a trespass. He went back a week later. The dirt mound was still there, but now a low, wet smell had started to rise from it. It was thick and sour, like rotten metal and stagnant water. David noticed that the grass around the mound had turned brown and stiff, even though it was a damp, rainy week. The smell started to bother him badly. It wasn't just at the cemetery. Sometimes he'd smell it late at night in his own house while lying in bed. It would start faint, then grow stronger until it filled his bedroom. He would open the window, but the air outside was clean. The smell was only in his room, and it smelled exactly like the unmarked grave. Then came the static. It started on his old radio. David liked to listen to old baseball games on the AM dial. But lately, when he tuned in, the signal would suddenly drop out, replaced by a thick, heavy hiss of static. It wasn't normal white noise. This static was deep and unsettling, and sometimes he felt like he could almost hear something underneath it, a quick, dry whisper, or maybe a distant dragging sound. He bought a new radio. The same thing happened. He'd be listening to music or news, and hissed the signal was gone, replaced by the heavy static and the faint sounds buried in it. One night, the static started up, and David noticed his reflection in the dark glass of the radio display. His face was gray, tired, and he realized he hadn't slept well since seeing that mound of earth. He called his sister, Lisa, who lived an hour away. He told her about the grave and the static. She laughed at him, told him he was obsessing over dirt. But later that night, she called him back, sounding scared. She had been listening to her own favorite podcast when her phone suddenly started screaming static. It wasn't her signal. It was the same thick, deep noise David described, and she swore she heard a dry, heavy thud sound right behind the wall next to her bed. They both realized that whatever was in the unmarked grave was reaching out. It didn't have a voice or a body or a headstone. It was using the closest thing it could find to transmit its presence, electronic static and the smell of the earth it was forced into. It was using the airwaves to broadcast its desperate, silent presence. David returned to the cemetery. It was raining hard. He stood over the dirt mound, pulling his jacket tight. He felt a desperate cold radiating off the soil, chilling him to the bone. He pulled out his phone, trying to record the atmosphere. He heard the telltale hiss as the static flooded his phone's audio recorder. He listened back instantly. The recording was almost all static, but then he heard it. The dry, quick whisper that he had heard faintly through the radio was loud and clear. It wasn't words. It was a single, sustained sound, like a horrible, thin cry of rage and desperate hunger. And then there was a scraping sound, as if something heavy and sharp was being dragged across a stone surface. David backed away slowly, looking down at the unmarked grave. He realized that something was trying to dig itself out. He saw a slight, shuddering movement in the wet soil of the mound. It was shifting, rising, like something underneath was pushing up. He ran back to his car. But when he drove away, he looked in the rearview mirror and saw a smear of heavy, dark soil across the glass. Not on the outside, on the inside. It was dirt that smelled sour and wet, sticking to the mirror like wet paint. He quickly wiped it off, panicked. When he got home, the static was everywhere. The TV, the kitchen clock, even the lamp in the corner, everything was humming with a low, deep electrical noise. The air was heavy with the metallic, sour smell of the grave. The sounds under the static were louder now, not whispers, but a rapid, rhythmic scratch, scratch, scratch. It sounded like fingernails against bone. David knew he was out of time. He raced back to the cemetery, grabbing a bag of concrete mix he kept in the garage for repairs. He had to stop the thing from getting out. When he reached the plot, the dark soil mound was cracked wide open. The smell was overpowering. The scratching was loud and fast. He scrambled to mix the concrete with rainwater and started pouring the thick, wet mixture directly onto the grave, packing the hole. As he worked, the static grew into a deafening roar. It felt like a physical pressure pressing against his eardrums. He heard a horrible, sucking sound from the earth, and the faint voice under the static finally became one word: let. He packed the last of the cement into the soil and backed away. The static died instantly. The sour smell vanished. Silence. David stood there, drenched in sweat and rain, listening to the absolute quiet of the cemetery. He had sealed the thing back into its unmarked prison. But the silence didn't last. When he returned home, exhausted, he went to his bedroom. His old radio, the one he thought was off, was glowing with a pale, sickly light. The speaker was whispering, but not with static. It was his sister, Lisa. She was screaming into the phone, saying the dry thud and the scratching were coming from inside her house now, right in the living room wall. And then the line went dead, replaced by the same low, hungry static. David realized he had only moved the grave's curse. He sealed one way out, but the forgotten thing had found a new, terrible frequency to travel on. It was desperate for a name, a marker, and a way to climb back out of the cold earth. And when David tried to silence it, he just opened a wider door. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. And if you believe the earth holds on to the things we forget, hit the like button and subscribe for more Black Hour Terror.